The dungeon city of the Fillard Kingdom was home to treasure-seeking adventurers, and in there lived the protagonist, Istolfa, who wandered as a homeless boy with lofty dreams of becoming an adventurer. To worsen his misery, he was still being bullied by thugs for money and had to pick herbs to meet their demands. One day, while picking herbs, an elven mamacita walked up to him, noting how experienced he was at his craft, but his looks didn't live up to the hype. He told her all he knew about herbs was thanks to information he purchased from the guild, and unexpectedly, she dropped a gold coin into his palms to thank him for sharing. Surprised at the amount, Istolfa politely turned it down, but the elf told him to seize that chance to change his life for the better. After considering how significantly his life could change and that he could finally fulfill his dreams of becoming an adventurer, he accepted the gold coin from her. Shortly before she left, the elf introduced herself as Stella, a gold-rank adventurer, and said they'd meet again. Istolfa visited the neighborhood's armory shop and asked him for some weapons in exchange for his coin. The man, Fleet, invited him into his house, got him cleaned up, gave him a new set of clothes and packaged a meal for him, and finally gave him a sword. Istolfa knew this was way too much for the small price he paid, but Fleet was only rewarding him for being courageous. Having fed him, Fleet sent Istolfa on his way, and determined to make Stella's gift count, Istolfa dashed to the dungeon. In the dungeon, he met an adventurer who advised him to fetch some magical stones near the core. Istolfa got in, but only a few steps in, he tripped, fell, and suddenly found himself in a bright field. Unlike what he knew and expected from dungeons, this dungeon looked different, and he had no idea what to do next. Either way, he kept moving and soon felt someone's presence, whom he assumed to be an adventurer. However, it turned out to be a goblin, so he took the initiative to strike the first blow with his sword, but the goblin defended against the attacks and Istolfa ended up on the floor. He couldn't believe that he didn't match up to even a weak, scrawny bun goblin, meaning his career was cooked. Through sheer determination, he defeated that goblin and remembered the adventurer's advice that he should retrieve the magical stone from the goblin. However, he stabbed the goblin's forehead to find the core, only to find that the guy was still alive. Luckily, someone fired an arrow into its head and rescued Istolfa, and it just happened to be Stella, who confessed that she had gone to ensure that he made good use of the coin she gave him. Just then, the goblin disappeared, so Stella explained that the corpses of monsters vanished after a while. This meant there was no magic stone for Istolfa after everything he went through, so he had to be quicker next time. He took off and found another goblin, defeated it, and retrieved its magic stone. But soon, another one appeared just behind him, wielding a dagger that almost broke Istolfa's sword. To protect his priceless weapon, Istolfa threw his sword to distract the goblin, and with his bare fists, punched the goblin's head to death. He then obtained the goblin's dagger, but it disappeared together with its owner, yet Istolfa found a brand new dagger in its place. At that moment, an adventurer appeared with Istolfa's broken sword and handed it over to him, so Istolfa asked him if he had suddenly appeared or if he was there the whole time. The man said he had been there the whole time, just like the monsters, who seemed to appear out of nowhere. It had something to do with the optics of the dungeon, which initially seemed like normal grassland but was more dangerous than it appeared. Istolfa asked some more questions about the sword he got, and the man said it was a special reward for defeating a goblin scout, and was sold for 3 times the price of the coin he had gotten from Stella. Before the man left, he warned Istolfa to be careful because not everyone he met in the dungeon was so nice, but Istolfa said everyone he had met that day was kind to him. But that was when he realized that the man had pricked him with a needle laden with a simple paralysis poison. That was his welcome party to the dangerous, blinding grassland dungeon. Soon, Istolfa realized that he couldn't move his body or speak, so he watched as the guy took his magical dagger to stab him with it. Screaming for help was of no use because at the current distance, no one would hear him, and his death would be tagged as a goblin casualty. Istolfa secretly hoped someone would come to his aid, and miraculously, his attacker's hand was slashed off. Again, it was Stella who had come to his rescue, and she quickly cured his paralysis by barely touching him. Once more, he was indebted to her and fell into her arms as he realized he could have died without her, while she explained that she had been following him the whole time. She suggested getting out of the dungeon because she had something to discuss with him outside. Later, she took him into a luxurious suite that she had been staying in, fed him, and unexpectedly asked him if he was interested in becoming her husband. Her sudden proposal fried his brain for a minute, and she clarified that she wanted him to be her husband because he was special and had so much resilience, despite all the things he had been through. Dude said he was yet to have his first cream spurt and therefore wasn't mature enough for her, but she said she was into guys like him and proved that he had a special quality she needed. She created a fire with magic, saying, like all elves, she possessed high mana and could control her magic as she pleased. She couldn't have a child with another elf and needed someone with low magical abilities to be her partner. Istolfa made the perfect choice for that, because not only did he have low levels of mana, but he had absolutely zero, meaning he would never even have a chance at being able to use magic. He couldn't believe his fate because every adventurer required a little bit of magic to progress in the dungeon, meaning he didn't even have bragging rights to call himself an adventurer. Stella told him not to be upset because the more monsters he defeated, the more he absorbed enough mana to become stronger. However, in his case, physical strength would be better for him because he didn't need any form of mana to get stronger, especially since he specialized in physical attacks. This was an advantage for him because he could even become stronger than normal adventurers and be ranked as a first-class adventurer, so she offered to teach him how to live like an adventurer. He would have an elf baddie as a wife and a tutor, so it would be buy one get one free. It seemed like a fair deal, and Istolfa knew he would probably die if he dared return to the dungeon with his current level of strength. He told Stella apologetically that he wasn't sure about being her husband, and the only thing on his mind was becoming a full-fledged adventurer, so he asked her to be his teacher. She agreed to the student-teacher kink if that's what he wanted, but that was in the hopes that they would fall in love and get married. Anyway, they would start by registering at the guild as a party and then deal with his cheap sword, because she wanted to know who sold it to him. Later, they registered as a party, and the guild receptionist asked him to sell his magic stone to the guild so he would be formally certified as a member, and presented with a bronze bracelet to signify his rank. Immediately after that, he was praised by everyone and urged not to die like a chicken. Their party name was Gladio, a name Stella had given, which meant earth in the elven language, inspired by Istolfa's earth-colored hair. After the guild, Stella suggested that they head over to the weapons shop where he got his sword. Getting there, Fleet found it suspicious that Stella of all people was his teacher because he had unresolved trust issues with elves. Stella retorted by asking if he was the one who gave Istolfa the cheap weapon that almost cost him his life. The man looked at the almost destroyed blade and said the damage inflicted meant Istolfa must have gone up against a special kind of blade. Surprisingly, the man said the blade would fix itself up the more he fought because, just as Stella suspected, the weapon was made from dungeon steel. This dungeon steel was crafted from the dungeon's recycled scrap, and since the scraps contained monsters and their weapons, which were formed from mana, the weapons made from dungeon steel would get stronger by striking the monster's mana stone. Seeing how amazing this weapon was, Istolfa asked why Fleet gave him such a high-end weapon, and the man explained that regular weapons required maintenance, and Istolfa was obviously too broke for that. Istolfa couldn't return to the dungeon with a broken dagger, so they suggested he sell the magic dagger he obtained from his last goblin fight to buy some armor. They didn't encourage him to use the dagger himself because he had no magic, so there was no point in carrying it. In addition, Fleet suspected that Istolfa would be a reckless fighter, so by wearing some armor, he would easily avoid attacks and increase his battle readiness. After considering all the advice, Istolfa sold the dagger to Fleet in exchange for some armor, and while on the way back, Stella told him that Fleet had done a perfect job coupling up his armor. They passed by the group of bullies who were always picking on Istolfa, but Stella told him not to worry because they won't attack them, although he should be careful when walking alone. Istolfa knew it was best for him to avoid them completely because if he showed any form of weakness at all, they would strike and strip him of everything, so he was desperate to become stronger as soon as possible. As they retired to bed, Istolfa lay on the floor, but Stella absolutely refused and carried him to her bed, saying he could start repaying her kindness right there. As he retired to bed, Istolfa realized that he had learned way too many lessons in one day, so he couldn't wait for the next day. The next morning, Istolfa told him she wouldn't be following him into the dungeon because she didn't want to impede his progress, and since he had some experience facing the dungeon's dangers, it was unlikely that he would repeat the same mistakes. Again, he found himself in the field, but he wasn't letting his guard down, so when a goblin came out of nowhere, he reflexively slew it in one hit. It was a great milestone that he could now execute goblins without problems, and he remembered what Fleet said about how he could repair his blade with magic stones. He struck the magic stones from the goblin, and his blade showed remarkable improvement in its crack. He also figured out that the size of the magic stone must be proportional to the strength of the monster, so he hoped to bump into stronger enemies. But he thought it wise to start by learning how to fight 2 goblins at a time. Just then, another adventurer ran past him, and Istolfa realized that the guy brought his trouble with him. From nowhere, flames were fired at them, coming from a goblin magician. The adventurer asked Istolfa to help him, so he first noticed that the goblin magician had a mana stone stick that was the source of its fire. So Istolfa aimed for its chest and stabbed it before the goblin could release any more flames. Istolfa asked the adventurer whether he was okay, but he didn't realize that a goblin fighter was right behind him and narrowly escaped the goblin's axe, which caused him to lose the pauldrons of his armor. Before delving into the fight, he assessed the situation, as his dagger was no match for the goblin's axe, so he asked the other adventurer to use his magic and cast a spell that would defeat it. However, the idiot had no spells that could help, so Istolfa was left by himself, thinking of how to defeat the goblin fighter. He planned to avoid its axe while the mage shot some flames at the goblin to blind it momentarily. Considering what he encountered the previous day, Istolfa still had trust issues with adventurers, but he knew he had no choice in that moment, so he waited for the mage's flame and instantly delivered the finishing strike to the goblin. The major thanked him for saving him and apologized for dragging him into his mess, and then he let Istolfa have the magic stones. Istolfa stabbed the stones with his damaged sword, and in no time, it was looking as good as new. The mage introduced himself as Kyle and shared that he was trying to get stronger by defeating more couplings, and then he suggested teaming up with Istolfa to defeat goblins. However, Istolfa remained distrustful and said he already had a party, so Kyle begged him, saying it was an opportunity for both of them to get stronger and that Istolfa could keep all the spoils because Kyle was only interested in becoming a stronger mage. Somehow, Istolfa felt that even though Kyle was a weirdo, he didn't seem like a bad person, so he agreed to team up. Still unconvinced, Istolfa asked Kyle why he chose a newbie like himself instead of a veteran adventurer who would most certainly grant Kyle a better experience. Kyle said he was struggling to get rid of a single goblin, and it seemed Istolfa had already mastered getting rid of goblins. Besides, Kyle already saw him as a friend. To prove that, he volunteered some information he got from the guild about the first floor of the dungeon that they were presently on. As expected, the first floor was teeming with goblins, ranging from magician goblins to fighter goblins, but goblins were the very least of their problems. He hadn't finished speaking when they were attacked by a grass wolf, which was said to have 3 times the ferociousness of a goblin fighter. For the time being, they could easily handle it because the strength of the grass wolf relied on the number of wolves there were. However, this wolf went on to signal the rest of its friends, and Kyle suggested that they run out of there before the others arrived. They attacked the wolf with fire magic and ran before it could recover, eventually escaping from the wolf. Kyle thanked Istolfa for helping him escape because he wouldn't have done so with his own strength, so Istolfa asked him why he was so intent on becoming a mage. In response, Kyle said he had no physical strength or sword skills but was talented with magic and found the fundamentals easy. However, he didn't really have the mana to use his magical knowledge and could only cast small spells, while nothing happened when he cast the larger spells. This made him a subject of ridicule in his family, and he was determined to prove them wrong, so that was his primary purpose. Just when things seemed calm, the grass wolf appeared from nowhere and attacked them, and Istolfa's counterattack seemed too tired. The grass wolf bit his leg, and he would have lost his leg if not for the shin guard. Meanwhile, Kyle was trying his best to cast spells and defend Istolfa in the process, but nothing seemed to be working. It was pretty clear this wolf wouldn't let them run away, and since Istolfa had no idea how to defeat such a beast, he suggested that they rely on Kyle's magic. Kyle cast his flames upon the wolf, while Istolfa tried to stop the wolf's movements by thrusting his armor into its mouth, because he was confident that the wolf's fangs weren't strong enough to pierce through the armor. As the wolf was stuck on him, Kyle cast flames upon it, throwing it off guard, giving Istolfa a chance to stab it with his sword. The boys celebrated their little win, and Istolfa thought they had seen it all until Kyle informed them that there was a floor guardian that they wouldn't have to worry about unless they planned to reach the next floor. Istolfa wanted to know more about the floor guardian, but Kyle insisted on keeping it until they both decided to go against it. He retrieved the magic stones, and they went on to defeat a couple more goblins, during which they realized that they had both gotten stronger. Afterward, Istolfa accidentally bumped into something, and they found themselves standing in front of an adventurer. Istolfa could tell that the man was a bronze adventurer, but he first had to scrutinize him with a bombastic side eye. The guy asked if they were also hunting goblins, and Istolfa answered that they were, but Kyle said it was none of his business. Thereafter, the adventurer wandered off and disappeared, so Istolfa asked Kyle why he acted the way he did. Apparently, Kyle says that the guy was going to be a problem, and told Istolfa not to be stupid and deceived by the guy's initial nice appearance because something seemed different about his eyes. Kyle suggested that they head back home for the day, but that was when both idiots realized that they couldn't find the exit. Kyle suggested that they find an orb of return, which was an item dropped by goblin scouts with which they could teleport back to the entrance in an instant. But since it was unusual to bump into goblin scouts, Kyle suggested a second option. According to what he had been told, the floor was only a big square, and the door through which they had entered was situated close to one of the four corners. So if they could just find a wall, they could follow it to find the exit. They were on the lookout for goblin scouts while searching for the wall, but only kept encountering normal goblins, and it was hard to distinguish them unless the goblin got closer. The goblins weren't drawn to them because they weren't like the glass wolf, which could track the scent of humans. Istolfa wished they could pick up other people's scents so he could register the scent of every girl's cooch. Kyle revealed that there was a way to detect adventurous magical energy, but since Istolfa had no mana, the spell wouldn't work on him. This made Istolfa realize that he had to work harder to avoid ending up as useless as he was and disappointing Fleet and Stella, who invested in him. Istolfa's countenance made Kyle so worried, so he asked to hear about everything that had happened in his past. After listening to his story, Kyle told Istolfa that he might be rushing desperately to be strong and could end up getting overwhelmed, so he should try to rely more often on his friends, especially Kyle, who wanted them to remain friends. Istolfa couldn't believe that anyone would care about him to that extent, and never knew that he would have a friend like this, so it felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulder. They sealed the beginning of a new friendship with a fist bump and resumed their attempts to get out of the dungeon. They found the wall and kept taking the puff that might lead to the exit, but Kyle pointed out that there was a chance of them stumbling upon the staircase leading to the next level, where the floor's guardian would be. After a while, they found a door eventually and wondered whether it was the exit or the staircase, but before they could fully realize where they were already facing the floor's guardian. The guardian ferociously swung at them with a giant axe, and Kyle sent his flames towards the guardian. This was pretty useless because the guardian was covered from head to toe in iron armor, so the boys realized they were better off finding an escape. Despite knowing the guardian was too smart for them to outrun, Istolfa said they had a chance at escaping since the guardian was mostly stationed at the entrance to the next floor, because he wouldn't be able to move far away from the staircase. After a countdown, they both ran to the exit but soon came to face another arrow attack from a goblin. In fact, there were two goblins, a goblin swordsman and a goblin archer, both of whom were more powerful than a goblin fighter. While Istolfa handled the goblin swordsman, Kyle turned his focus to the goblin archer, but noticed that it seemed confused and didn't know when to shoot because he could end up shooting his ally instead of Istolfa. Kyle decided to act fast and strike the goblin with his staff, while Istolfa kept sparring with the goblin swordsman. In the end, he also defeated his goblin, and the guys were happy to have become stronger. The goblin archer vanished, but the goblin swordsman left behind a magic stone, which turned out to be an orb of return. Kyle was surprised because the information he bought said it was only goblin scouts that left behind orbs of return, and this meant that they were the first to discover that goblin swordsmen could also leave such orbs. This also meant they could report their findings to the guild and make the information recognized, increasing their reputation among adventurers. Istolfa admitted that by himself, he wouldn't have figured out the whole thing, and he was glad he made a new friend, even as they both returned to the guild. When they returned, Kyle almost passed out and puked from the spinning effect of the orb of return, an effect that occurred because he wasn't used to the orb. Later at the guild, Istolfa earned some books after selling the magic stones he obtained during their adventure, and Kyle submitted the information that they wanted to sell about the orb of return. However, the guild receptionist told him that multiple people had reported similar incidents, and the guild was finding it difficult to confirm the validity of their claims. Hence, it would be hard to accept Kyle and Istolfa's. The boys decided to return home, and the receptionist warned them to be careful when walking down a certain alley due to recent reports of dangerous gangs appearing at night there. The boys noticed that all the light sources had been turned down in the alley, and only a few seconds into their walk, they were already surrounded by folks. The thugs asked them to hand over everything in their possession and run, and this triggered memories from Istolfa's traumatic past. However, Kyle reminded him that with all the monsters they had fought in the dungeon, they would certainly not lose against those idiots, and Istolfa wouldn't be robbed anymore. When the thugs heard this, they were pissed that Kyle dared to look down on them and said they would get rid of them with only a few strikes. So Kyle opened the show by casting some spells on the dogs, confident that no one would die because his magic was still weak. From there, it was a full-blown physical fight and sparring of swords between Istolfa and one of the thugs, with Istolfa winning, much to the thug's surprise. He was angry, considering everything he had gone through in the past, and was determined not to let it happen again. So he didn't back down until a guard suddenly showed up, and the thugs scrammed away. The guards thanked Istolfa and Kyle for helping to apprehend the thugs, and offered to escort them back to their accommodations to thank them. On the way, they met Stella, who was drawn to the spot by the ruckus she heard. So Istolfa introduced Kyle to her, and it suddenly seemed like she and Kyle were long-lost siblings at war. Stella made a comment about him having a lot to improve as a major, but still having the potential to be really strong. And Kyle was offended and pissed and called her a gothic cougar from Temu. In any case, Stella was glad that Istolfa had someone to team up with because she wasn't venturing into the dungeon with him anyway. After saying their goodbyes, Stella had pitiful thoughts about Kyle, who, despite being a genius, had subpar magical skills and was mocked by his family, who called him the toy mage, despite being the fourth heir to the throne of the kingdom of Filard. She smiled because Kyle was just like Istolfa, who knew nothing about the world and still had a long way to go. The next morning, Stella woke Istolfa to go to the dungeon, and Kyle later came to pick him up, saying they had to stop by the armory before heading into the dungeon because he was embarrassed by Istolfa's tattered armor. They stopped at Fleet's shop, and he told them that the thugs had stolen some weapons from his shop and attacked some people with them. However, he was impressed to find out that Istolfa and Kyle had defeated the thugs. He noticed that Istolfa's armor was quite tattered and asked whether he had come to repair it, but Kyle said that they had come to buy something better. Fleet said armors weren't things to be replaced whenever one felt like it, but rather when the situation called for it. However, Kyle said that, even though Istolfa's current armor was perfect for goblins on the first floor, it would not suffice for the second floor, where they would be embarking soon. The fleet was surprised to hear that the boys were ready to take on the first floor's guardian, and even more surprised when he heard that he had deflated a swordsman, a fighter, an archer, and a magician goblin, not to mention a grass wolf. After seeing evidence of the progress Istolfa had made, Fleet asked him about his budget, and Istolfa said he had a couple of bucks he had earned from the adventure, so Fleet went to fetch something that'd suit his budget. However, Kyle quickly went over to the plate armor section and said he would have chosen that for Istolfa if it wasn't too heavy. Fleet emerged with hard leather armor, which had some magic beast skin in it. Examples of such magic beasts would be the grass wolves, and even though their skin was much lighter than metal, they could repel arrows from an archer and a goblin guard, so the armor was of the highest quality. Fleet said he was willing to sell it at a discount to Istolfa, but his daughter whacked him on the head because he had previously told her no one wanted to buy the armor on account of its shady history. Yet there, he was trying to sell something of that nature to Istolfa. The shady history was that the armor was a special piece commissioned for the child of a noble family. However, the child died while it was still being produced, and people felt it was cursed because it was made from the skin of magic beasts. Stella tried to confirm the rumors but said there was no curse, and he was just a regular magic beast armor. Fleet increased the price of the armor, ignoring Istolfa's little protest, but he said that if Istolfa really wanted it, he would just keep it on reserve until he could earn the complete money needed. After seeing that it would require them to sacrifice their trip to the second floor that day, Kyle said he could just make more money on the first floor and train some more. In the meantime, Istolfa was thankful to Fleet for always watching out for him, and Fleet helped him fix the tears in his old armor while adding a shield as extra protection. As they headed out to the guild, Stella said Kyle and Istolfa would have to register as a party, but Kyle said he wanted a third-party member because, with just the two of them, they were only limited to attacking and needed a third member who could serve as a healer. Alpha pointed out that it was unlikely for anyone to want to join their party, considering that they were just two virgin soy boys comforting each other, but they still enthusiastically went out to look for a new member. Coincidentally, a newbie elf had just arrived at the guild and was seeking party members to team up with. On the other hand, Kyle and Istolfa went around scouting for a third member but got turned down more times than your female bestie refused to let you hit. In the end, they accepted that they were just two directionless bums and more people would be interested in joining a stronger team. Stella wished them luck since Kyle refused to listen to her recommendations. His reason was that, while she might recommend a perfectly capable party member, he wasn't sure whether that party member would make a good friend for him and Istolfa, and it was relevant that whoever would join them had to be someone they could trust. Very excitedly, they said they would have to find someone on their own terms, but since they had failed for the day, they decided to go back into the dungeon and brush up on their skills. Up ahead, they saw someone who wasn't being permitted into the dungeon, who looked like a priest and a dark elf. The guy was pissed at the guards and walked off with so much rage in his eyes, and then he suddenly begged them to explore the dungeon with him. He introduced himself as Duma, saying he probably looked like a weak priest but was pretty strong. Before Istolfa knew it, he was getting dragged into the guild. However, Kyle told them to hold up for a minute and blasted Duma for coming in between himself and Istolfa without even saying hello. But after a bit of word exchange, all three of them presented themselves to the guard, and we were immediately allowed to enter. Kyla and Istolfa had questioning looks in their eyes and whispered about Duma, saying he didn't seem like a bad person and was a healer, which is pretty convenient for them. Duma complained about how they won't let a priest enter alone, so he was glad that he had finally made it in. Kyle explained that it would be a death mission for a healer to try and fight on their own, so he asked why Duma attempted such a thing. Duma said he was frustrated because no one wanted to team up with a dark elf like himself, but Kyle told him that his personality was even darker. Before they commenced their adventure for the day, Kyle insisted on knowing what god Duma served, because there were different gods, and the type of magic the priest received depended on the god they served. He was particularly wary of domino priests who could only use weird magic, and it turned out that Duma had strength-enhancing magic. Kyle felt it was important to know everything about someone they were going to go on adventures with, but Istolfa reminded him that what they asked for was not a pawn but a friend instead, so Kyle apologized for being inconsiderate, and Duma was so grateful to Istolfa that he offered to tell him about the god he served. Apparently his god was Neilchanter, the god of dungeon arms who bestowed powerful skills. Kyle told Duma he was counting on him to support Istolfa, and he told him to be assured because he would. After a while, Duma realized that he couldn't sense any monster around, but just then, a ferocious beast attacked them from behind, and Duma quickly yanked Kyle out of the way and struck the wolf with his spear in one hit. Seeing what had happened, both boys couldn't believe that Duma had taken down a grass wolf all by himself, and Istolfa felt responsible because he hadn't done a good job as a support. But Duma told him he was supposed to be at the vanguard, and if an enemy managed to slip past him, then the rear guard would take care of it. Duma also said it needed them both to be responsible and do their jobs, but Kyle said they shouldn't even consider trusting him because he'd be dead in an instant when fighting a grass wolf. When asked what his role in the group was in the first place, Kyle said he was the brain of the operation and still planned to get strong either way. After their petty fight, they resumed exploring the dungeon, and when Duma heard about Istolfa's issue with his armor and his plans on exploring the second floor, he reassured him that he could rely on him and drop the formality. Just then, they came face to face with two goblins, one being a fighter goblin and the other a goblin swordsman. Even though both Kyle and Istolfa had dealt with similar goblins the previous day, he knew he couldn't let his guard down against them. Luckily, Duma offered to handle the swordsman while telling Istolfa that the fighter was too big for him to handle. Kyle said he would launch a big magic attack to slow the goblins down while leaving them both to handle the physical aspect. He launched his attack and created some confusion among the goblins, after which Istolfa and Duma both attacked the goblins. However, they found out that there was a goblin magician hiding out of sight, but Kyle handled that one and told Istolfa that he wasn't the only one fighting, and he should place his attention on the thing that mattered. In the process, he came to appreciate what it meant to rely on others, and was even more determined to win the fight because he wouldn't risk giving up on his friends. With pure grit and determination, he successfully defeated the goblin fighter and retrieved its stone. Duma said he was able to acquire a new spell that was called Heavy Weapon, because it would increase the weight of any weapon. They helped to take down some more goblins because they needed to defeat 10 to 20 of them if they were to afford Istolfa's new armor. But Duma asked them if the goblins might have been all hanging out somewhere, because they might have taken out all the ones walking around. Just then, they stumbled upon someone, an adventurer who was wounded, and said that an abnormally strong goblin had injured him and gotten rid of his party members. The guy introduced himself as Morrison, a healer who had encountered an extremely powerful goblin that caused damage with just a single sword move. They suspected that the goblin could be a swordsman since it was a goblin with a sword, but not even a swordsman was strong enough to accomplish that. They asked Morrison if the goblin was using a special kind of sword, but all he said was that his party's heavy knight was still trying to fight it, and he wasn't sure how long he could hold off, so he was begging them to help. Duma said he didn't mind helping because he was a priest, and that was what was expected of him anyway, so Morrison emphasized that they needed to hurry. However, Kyle said that was a place newbie hunters hung out, and it could be a trap, and that even if Morrison was telling the truth, a top-tier adventurer would have trouble defeating the goblin in question, let alone them. However, Istolfa said he couldn't abandon him, so Kyle eventually agreed to help him. Morrison brought them to the location where they were attacked and, unfortunately, found a mage who was long dead and the heavy knight who was about to be finished off by the goblin. Kyle quickly activated a spell, but the goblin dodged the spell, and the priest activated a speed assist spell, which helped Istolfa's body to be significantly light. So he aimed for the goblin's sword, but found out it wouldn't be an easy task to disarm the goblin, because he was significantly stronger than most of the other goblins, and seemed to predict Istolfa's movements. As they fought on, the goblin somehow got around Istolfa's shield and had its sword pointed at his sides, but Duma stepped in and whacked it out of the way. The goblin almost got Duma, so Kyle covered for him, and all three of them, after some deliberation, realized that the goblin was no swordsman but most probably a goblin hero, and it was the strongest of the goblins because it usually was found on the second floor. During the fight, Duma warned Istolfa to do everything to avoid a head strike, but while he was trying, the goblin stepped back and its sword started glowing, revealing ancient runes that stated that this was a sword that could cut anything. Before Duma could warn Istolfa to get out of the way, the goblin had already chopped his hand off, so Duma activated the heavy weapon spell and chopped off the goblin's hand too. Soon, the goblin was looking for its sword, and Duma knew it was best that they defeat it before the goblin could find its sword. So Kyle stepped up and activated a spell, Gigabolt, which barely affected the goblin because it still managed to get back on its feet. Meanwhile, Istolfa was still on the floor, feeling like a failure as he watched his friends fight while he was busy being a waste of sperm cells. However, he knew he had to protect them and spotted something in the distance that he could use to fight. Meanwhile, Kyle's attacks were no longer working because the goblin had somehow learned to predict the trajectory of his attacks. But just when it looked like all hope was lost, Istolfa quickly rushed, picked up the goblin's sword and sliced it in half, instantly defeating it. He immediately passed out, so Duma told him he'd reconnect his chopped-off arm with a healing spell and then praised him for doing a good job. Later, at the guild, the receptionist was shocked to hear that the boys defeated a goblin hero, but they proved that it indeed was a goblin hero by submitting its sword. For their information on the goblin hero, the guild offered to pay them a good sum while hailing them for defeating a goblin hero, because for newbies, doing something such as that in such a short time was impressive. The guild receptionist told Istolfa that he was pretty close to making copper, and it was about time he started exploring the next floor. As the boys left, Istolfa wondered whether it was okay for them to keep the goblin's sword, even though Morrison willingly gave it to them. But his teammates told him that they were the ones who put their lives in danger, and that was his little token of appreciation. Meanwhile, alphas are almost as good as new, all thanks to Duma and Morrison's healing spells. As usual, Istolfa's clothes reeked of poverty, and Kyle was over it, so he asked that they head to the armory. They took the goblin hero's sword to flee, and he told them that the very nature of that sword was even more deadly than they knew, and they were lucky to escape. However, he asked Istolfa again if he was willing to sell the sword, and Istolfa said he was, so he offered him a hefty sum. Afterwards, Istolfa asked Fleet to sell him the beast hide armor, and he felt a lot stronger wearing it. As they planned to separate, the boys said they were hungry, so they went to a restaurant, but Istolfa wasn't eating because he was accustomed to going for days without eating, and his stomach was used to being empty. They encouraged him to eat because he would start requiring more food as he got stronger, but he said that would mean he would have to use all his money. The boys called him an idiot and told him that he should use that as motivation to keep making more money and not settle for hunger. This inspired Istolfa to hustle harder and eventually agree to eat, but he was joined by Stella, who introduced herself to Duma, but it seemed these two weren't going to get along either. Stella said she heard about the boys defeating a goblin hero because everyone at the guild was talking about it. The boys noted that before fighting the goblin hero, they didn't see any other goblins, and Stella explained that this happened because the goblin hero was nearby, and the other goblins were terrified of it. She finalized the advice by telling them that there will be monsters way stronger than the goblin hero, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. She rewarded Istolfa for surviving by burying his face in her tiny slice of heaven, while the other guys wished they were him. Also, Istolfa officially invited Duma to join their party, and Duma said he was looking forward to fighting beside Istolfa, making Kyle jealous. Stella paid for dinner as a reward for the boys defeating the hero, and they retired for the evening. On the way, Stella handed Duma a letter as proof of her approval that he could take to the guild and gain easy access to Istolfa and Kyle's party. The boys discussed taking down the goblin guard so they could move on to the second floor, and Istolfa realized that this gift of friendship was something he was grateful for, so he had to become a teammate that the boys could rely on. The next day finally arrived, and the boys braced themselves for a fight with the goblin guard. But Kyle told them that if they took down the goblin hero, it would be easy to take down the goblin guard, and all they needed to do was stick to the plan they had made. To begin with, the boys knew the goblin guard's armor was made out of iron, which made it hard to penetrate. But since Duma's mace was made out of steel, it was very effective against iron, and by applying Duma's heavy weapon spell on that, they would be able to break right through its armor. The plan was for Kyle and Duma to start by distracting the goblin guard, while Istolfa would deliver the finishing attack. So far, the plan was working, and all Istolfa needed was one more hit to end it. But the next thing they saw was tons of goblins. So Kyle and Duma had to focus on the goblins while trusting Istolfa to handle the goblin guard. Only a few hits in, Istolfa had already successfully cracked through the goblin guard's armor, and the other guys had defeated the goblins. They told him that the goblin guard's magic stone was important evidence of their completion of the first floor, so they entrusted it to his hands. It was finally time for them to explore the second floor, and everyone was filled with anxiety about what to expect and how much stronger the monsters could be. Somehow, they found themselves in some sort of hut with something that looked like an orb of return, but a voice told them that it was an orb of progress, and by touching it, it would record what floor they had progressed to. They turned to find some guy who welcomed them to the second floor, which was called the Forest of Gluttony, adding that the hut was the only safe haven on the entire floor, meaning every adventurer in there had come to challenge the second floor, but most of them had given up trying to progress because the strength of the monsters was on a whole other level. The boys asked them why they were still in there if they were giving up progress, so the adventurers responded, saying that even though they couldn't progress to the next floor, this second floor was quite profitable, and a lot of them were choosing to stay there just to collect goods to sell for money. Kyle soon lost interest in the conversation he was having with those losers and told them to go, but Istolfa bowed and thanked them for teaching them about the second floor. On their way out, one of the adventurers told them to beware of beetles because their shells were pretty hard and couldn't be penetrated easily, and it would be best to avoid attacking them head-on. While the boys left, the other adventurers snickered at them, wondering why they were so unnecessarily serious. The boys eventually arrived at the Forest of Gluttony and saw how beautiful it was compared to the first floor, with luscious fruits everywhere that looked so perfect. They wondered if it was okay to eat them, but were careful because it could all be a trap. Kyle had a theory of his own because he was not currently feeling hungry, as opposed to how hungry he would feel if he wasn't inside the dungeon, so perhaps that was why it was called the Force of Gluttony. Istolfa asked to borrow Duma's mace again because he was quite wary of the beetles they were warned about, so he told them to keep their cards up. Meanwhile, Kyle kept observing how spooky the forest looked, as he noticed a path where the trees looked planted in a row on purpose. The unnatural fruits were also something to notice because they looked like the fruits were just calling out, so he generally assumed that something out of the ordinary was exerting its will on the forest. Just then, they heard a rustle and assumed their positions, but were unable to see what was headed in their direction because of the trees. Suddenly, Istolfa was attacked but blocked it with his shield and realized that his attacker was one of the beetles the adventurers in the hut had warned him about. These beetles were a whole other species because one beetle was as big as a human head, and more of them came out in their numbers. Istolfa immediately remembered the advice he was given by the adventure, but Kyle screamed that they couldn't just clump up in one place. The boys ran for their lives, and Istolfa stayed back, trying to attack them despite knowing his odds of victory were low because any slip-up from him would result in death, as the beetles were way too fast to keep up with. Kyle tried to aim a magical attack at them, but it proved nearly impossible to direct the attacks because the beetles were too fast. He went all out instead, since his spell wasn't that strong, with a heat web spell which temporarily slowed the beetles down, because no matter how hard the shells were, sudden temperature changes would be difficult for them to keep up with. The beetles slowed down, and Istolfa got the chance to finish them off. After saying that they had barely survived these beetles, the guys realized that the second floor won't be a piece of cake to deal with. Istolfa said he was going to collect the magic stones from the defeated beetles, while Kyle theorized that the adventurers who had mentioned something about the floor being perfect were probably trying to collect some of the juicy fruits while fighting the food beetles. Now Kyle felt all those adventurers must be strong enough to fight off the beetles, but questioned whether the floor was that profitable that it was worth remaining there and not moving on, or perhaps there was something more sinister preventing them from going on. Meanwhile, Istolfa was trying to retrieve magical stones, but the beetles had hard shells and he couldn't pierce them. Kyle said it would be difficult for them to advance on the floor with that dagger in Istolfa's possession, so they had to get something a level higher for him at the very least. Unfortunately, high-level weapons were pretty expensive, and they would have had to start saving up again, but Duma said that, since Arthur's dagger was a dungeon weapon, it would just be a lot better to level it up. Istolfa said that it would be time-consuming because they had to defeat an entire army of goblins just to fix a single scratch on the dungeon dagger he had. However, Duma revealed that he had been learning a new spell while they were fighting, a spell called magic synthesis, which functioned by using magic to combine the weapons and the magic stones instead of striking the stones. In that way, all the magic would enter the sword without escaping into the air, and they could use the spell to level up the sword several times faster instead of spending so much money. Kyle and Dua suggested using all the magic stones they picked to make this happen, but Istolfa didn't feel it was fair for them to use all the profit only on his sword. The boys told him they would do anything to make him strong because they were on the same team, and Duma went on to activate the spell. After casting some spells, he had successfully upgraded the dagger, making it so incredible that one could tell it was already a much stronger weapon. He thanked Duma and said they should collect more magic stones to make the dagger even more powerful. Afterward, Kyle noted that it was pretty strange because magic normally shouldn't make a weapon stronger, and this meant that they should expect the unexpected because no one really understood that environment or why it existed. Just when they were thinking of how to come up with a strategy, they heard a snort, and the next thing was they were getting attacked by a wild boar, which had an outer shell looking like hardened armor. This time around, the guys decided to run for their lives because the armored boar was known as the berserker of the jungle, feared even by the most experienced adventurers. The boar was rather fast and ferocious, so the boys knew if it rammed into them, those baby jewels would be smashed. Eventually, they made it to the safe haven and could barely catch their breath, so they decided to continue their adventure the next day. Later that evening, Stella heard all about their adventure, but Kyle was pissed when she laughed at them, because all he knew was that he was about to be flattened like a pancake. She told them that the ambo was indeed a threat, but it wasn't impossible to overcome, and they had allowed fear to override their senses so much that they didn't pay attention to its movements. She instructed them to next time try to observe its movements and rewarded Istolfa by sharing a vital piece of information concerning the dungeon. She said every floor of the dungeon had its rules. For example, the first floor seemed like a large open space at first glance, but any beast could sneak up on an adventurer, and as such, the rule for the second floor stated that as long as adventurers ate the fruits, monsters wouldn't attack them. The boys assumed that all they had to do was eat the fruit, but Stella told them not to even try it if they wanted to advance to the next floor at all or even be alive in the first place. The boys asked her why they shouldn't eat the fruits, but she told them that they were to figure that out for themselves because not everything was as good as it appeared. The next day, the boys used the Orb of Progress to teleport themselves to the second floor, but there was no one in the safe haven, unlike the previous day. They decided to discuss their survival strategy, and Duma showed that he got a shield specifically for defending against forest enemies. Because, since he stood at the rear, this could help to harden up their defenses so he could defend and protect Kyle while Istolfa focused on dealing with enemies on the front end. The shield looked heavy, and they wondered how Duma could carry it, but in his thoughts, Istolfa wondered specifically whether Duma was a man or a woman. Anyway, Duma assured them that he had the strength to carry the shield because he had gotten stronger ever since they started exploring the dungeon. Also, they noted that Kyle's magic had gotten a lot more reliable, and even Kyle noted that he had more control and could help with a bit of attack magic. The boys started discussing their strategy, starting from the information that was received from the guild, stating that the guardian of the second floor was known as the Mainator. This beast was a gigantic man-eating plant monster, which was bright red and had a bunch of creepy green vines on it. They were still unable to find more information about the fruits, and all that everyone kept telling them was that if they ate any of the fruits, monsters wouldn't attack them. Anyway, they decided to stop talking and start fighting monsters, so they encountered a variety of monsters ranging from wild apes to carnivorous mushrooms and more beetles. They were barely catching their breath when they suddenly encountered the armored boar yet again. So the boys started running until they realized that Istolfa stayed behind and was trying to defeat the monster. His motivation was Stella's words from the previous night, where she said that the armored boar was dangerous but very possible to overcome, so he counted down to observe the boar's movements. But just then, Duma attacked the boar with the spell and asked Istolfa whether he had lost his mind. However, Istolfa felt he had figured it out and noted that whenever the boar started charging, it could only move straight forward and was unable to move for a split second in the process. This meant that the boar had no control over its power or speech, so instantly, Kyle came up with a strategy and said he would handle the boar himself. He called the boar a pig and pissed it off, and while he was coming, he cast a magical spell which froze its legs. This temporarily stopped the wild boar, leaving it rolling aimlessly on the ground. What they learned from this was that even though Kyle's ice was weak, it was strong enough to keep the wild boar stock in the ground, so if he channeled plenty of magic into his attack, it would last for a longer time. The boys were happy after defeating the wild boar, and Duma placed his hands on the boar to prevent the magic stone from disappearing, because the rule was said that if they kept touching the monster, it would not disappear. Kyle realized that they had been foolish all this time, thinking they had to run to get the stone before it disappeared, and realizing that there were so many more things that could have been mistaken, especially now that Stella had mentioned something about things not being as they appeared. Later, they were approached by an adventurer, who was impressed that they were the ones who defeated the armored boar because he recognized them as the boys who had come a day before. He offered to answer any questions they had about the second floor and invited them to return to the hut with him. So the boys held a brief meeting to decide whether they could trust him or not. Kyle said they could try trusting him because he knew more about the floor than they did, and if anything happened, all three of them could handle things. Istolfa asked why the adventure was a little under-equipped, but he said he was okay because he had no reason to worry about the monsters attacking him. Duma asked him whether he had eaten one of the fruits, and the guy admitted to eating it, saying he was able to move around freely, and they won't have to worry about anything as long as they aren't trying to progress to the next floor. He explained that in the forest of gluttony, humans were prey to be eaten by the predator monsters. It was essentially the rule of that floor. But eating the fruit put humans on an equal level to monsters in the hierarchy, meaning monsters may no longer attack the humans, but they would no longer be able to oppose the floor guardian now that it was directly above them, and they wouldn't progress to the next floor. The boys worried about this and asked if he was okay with that kind of life, but he said his dream life was eating those forbidden fruits and getting off to freaky monsters. Kyle thought of this as a very boring life, existing with no aim or direction because there was no difference between doing that and being dead. But that was when he realized that this was kind of different from what Stella told them. They were about to ask him more questions when they suddenly heard a loud scream from inside and realized he had been ambushed by a monster. That was when they remembered what Stella said, which was that most, not all, monsters won't attack them after eating the fruit, not to mention that if they wanted to live, they shouldn't consider eating the fruit. The boys could sense that something was coming, so they prepared themselves and a masked humanoid figure emerged from the room. They weren't sure whether the figure that approached was a monster, but it had an ominous aura and seemed more powerful than anything they had ever fought against on that floor. Before anyone could catch its movements, the monster appeared right in front of Istolfa, and within seconds, they were clashing swords. He couldn't get over the shock and fell to the ground as something dark and unexplainable took over him when he stared into the monster's eyes. Immediately, his teammates came to his rescue, and they ran into the forest, admitting that there was no way they could defeat whatever that thing was. It then meant that eating the fruit couldn't protect them from all sorts of monsters who were probably exceptions to the rule. Istolfa explained that when he fought it, he felt like the creature was rather ominous and had withheld its true powers. The boys considered running but realized that it was nearly impossible to escape the monster. And even more annoying was that they couldn't fight a foe whose identity or nature they didn't know. Kyle thought hard for a minute, realizing that it was impossible to escape from a monster that was the reincarnation of the Flash, and if they weren't fast enough, they would get caught while descending the stairs. His current magical energy could only permit him to use a small spell, so he was distressed about it. Duma and Istolfa told him not to worry about it because things usually turned out fine if they worked together. They strategized again, thinking of magical spells that could restrict the monster's speed, or anything close to that, since there were no magical spells that could restrict speed. As the monster approached, Istolfa resumed clashing swords with the monster and even managed to catch it off guard, all thanks to Duma's light weapon spell, which made his weapon lighter and made his moves easier. In the end, he managed to land significant cuts on the monster and thought he had almost defeated it. But as he delivered the final blow, he stared into the monster's eyes and suddenly realized he couldn't move, almost as if he had been cursed. The monster kicked him to the ground, and he couldn't breathe. So Kyle immediately froze the monster's foot to the ground while Duma threw his shield at the monster to break the curse he had placed on Istolfa and allow him to resume fighting again until he had completely defeated the monster. The boys were spent and decided to get back to the safe haven before more monsters would attack them. But as they saw the body of the monster disappear, they realized that the humanoid figure was indeed a monster. In the end, they returned home and met Stella again, and then asked her what she meant by telling them they would end up dead if they ate the fruit. She started by mentioning the monster in the robe, asking them if they would have defeated it if they had let their guards down and eaten the fruit. The guys mentioned the adventurer whom they had met on the way, saying the guy probably was lucky because they didn't see his body when they returned. So they thought he managed to get away since the hut was supposed to be a safe haven. Stella had a sad look on her face and asked them if they really believed that the hut was safe even after seeing the monster attack them there. And then she asked them who told them that piece of information in the first place. Kyle said that the men believed that the hut was safe, which was why the adventurers also told them that it was safe. But Stella surprisingly revealed that the hut was popularly known by adventurers as the Forest Watchman's hut, and that there was no way he would permit arrogant punks who stole fruit from the forest to get away. The boys told her they didn't find anybody when they returned to the hut, but Stella reminded them that eating the fruits placed adventurers on the same level as monsters, and when monsters die, they disappear. The boys were horrified as they realized that Stella was saying the truth, even as she revealed that it was foolish to expect to see a safe haven in a dungeon that was supposed to test adventurers. The next day, the boys took the day off, because Istolfa returned to the armory with his armor. Looking tattered, and all of that so Fleet told him he was acting too reckless and could lose his life if he kept going on like that. So he forbade him from going to the dungeon until the armor was fixed, which would take a few days. Also tried to protest the break, but his teammates didn't even help him and told him to have fun all by himself. He wondered how to spend his time and took a walk into town, during which he met Fleet's daughter, Kay, and told her he didn't know how to spend his day off because he was a die-hard hustler who never had a second to spare. Kay invited him to go shopping with her and held his hands, although his eyes showed that he wanted her to hold something else. They went shopping, but some people made horrible remarks about Istolfa's tattered clothes, so Kay took him to an adventurer's shop and got him a crisp pair of clothes, although she got upset when the shopkeeper referred to Istolfa as her boyfriend, because he was just her doppelganger. Istolfa thought she reacted this way because of how shabby he looked and made her feel embarrassed, so he asked if they could spend more time shopping so he would learn more. The day went by really fast, and Istolfa was hungry, so Kay offered to take him to a small restaurant. Before they got there, Istolfa thanked her for helping him learn about normal things outside of being an adventurer, so she suggested that they could do more of that daily, because his life as an adventurer was stealing him away, and he had changed from who he used to be before becoming an adventurer. Istolfa got lost in thought as he pondered what she said, but he realized that he wanted to become an adventurer so he could cash out, become stronger, and escape his miserable life. But when he snapped out of his thoughts, he realized Kay was missing and had been captured by some adventurers. Apparently they knew him as the rookie everyone at the guild was talking about, unsaid. If any more people joined the guild, people would start fighting for quests, so they had to get rid of people like Istolfa. They threatened to stuff Kay up if he made a move, but he did make that move, and the mage among them put up a sound barrier while instructing the other guy to hurry up and get rid of Istolfa before the barrier's effects ran out. Kay managed to set herself free from her captor's grasp and started running with Istolfa, who realized he was too weak to protect her and had to become stronger. In no time, the major realized that his spell had disappeared, and it was all thanks to Stella, who had spotted the barrier and decided to check it out. She confronted them for tormenting her apprentice, healed Istolfa's wounds, and turned her attention to the scoundrels. Apparently the mage dude was a silver rank who felt unstoppable, but Stella whooped his ass and gave him a little talk about how his strength was worthless, and anyone could get stronger with a little bit of training. After disciplining the fools, she told Istolfa and Kay to leave, and then Istolfa thanked her for coming to the rescue. Also, he considered her words to the scoundrel, realizing that perhaps, with more effort, he would become an adventurer strong enough to protect others like Stella had just protected him. He then told Kay that he didn't want to have a normal life, but aimed to become a top-tier adventurer. Kay was initially disappointed, but accepted that she couldn't change it, and said that he shouldn't just become a strong person but maintain his kindness in the process, and he promised her just that. Meanwhile, Stella went through some reports and realized that Istolfa would soon be clearing the second floor, and that he demonstrated that there was nothing he couldn't overcome. Days later, the boys resumed exploring the second floor of the dungeon and were facing the Maynator, with Kyle initiating the attack with a flame blast spell, which burned the tree to the ground, bringing them to the end of conquering the second floor. The boys were proud of themselves and couldn't believe that they had gotten strong enough and improved from being those boys who could barely defeat goblins to who they were now. 3 months later, the boys had already completed the 5th floor of the dungeon and had become full-fledged adventurers who were only steps away from attaining bronze class. Everyone in the guild talked about how Istolfa and his team members had refused to give up in any sort of situation, and Istolfa reported their progress to Stella, who was really proud of them. It was strange that she appeared at the guild suddenly, and Kyle asked her why she was always appearing out of nowhere, but she just smiled and said she had something to do with Istolfa. Obviously, the two boys were just irritated because Stella was being stingy with her sugar. Apparently, Stella wanted to get Istolfa a gift at the armory as a present for his excellent performance. He had been using a short sword for a while, and since those weapons were only designed for beginners, lacked finesse, and had limitations, it would be better for Istolfa to choose a much better weapon because he was no longer a beginner. Fleet suggested that he use a falchion, which he claimed could chop down even the armor of enemies, depending on how it was used. Since it wasn't heavy and was easy to use, Stella paid for it and told him to use it however he wanted, just the same way he used the coin she gave him at the very start. She told him he had grown so much to make his choices and that no matter what, he would eventually achieve the goal he was aiming for. His boys came to get him, and they arrived at the 6th floor of the dungeon, named the Phantom City of Memories. Most of the signs in the city were written in a strange, ancient language, because the city was a recreation of the ancient mercenary kingdom of Saradia. To get past the 6th floor, they had to find hidden keys around the city that each individual person could recognize, something only a certain person could see. They opened a door leading to a room, and just as they got in, Duma was almost attacked from behind by a phantom. The phantom called them thieves and proceeded to attack them, but they also easily took it down, and they realized that the phantoms were probably not that strong. Also, if the phantom appeared in the house they were currently at, it means that the house belonged to the phantom because all the monsters on the 6th floor were humanoids that lived and worked in the surrounding houses and shops. Somehow, the boys realized that there were still traces of the people who still lived there and some sort of warmth from a home, meaning there was a likelihood that the phantoms were the ghosts of those who had lived there before. However, Kyle warned the other two to remember that the phantoms were monsters, regardless of what they thought, and the fact that they left stones behind after dying proved his point. They returned their focus to finding the keys, but after a whole day of going in and out of various houses, they still hadn't found anything, and since they had to fight off phantoms in all the houses, Kyle was running out of mana. But suddenly, the entire atmosphere turned dark, meaning it was already nighttime, and they had to hide because it was at that time that the phantoms of armed robbers and murderers appeared, which were much stronger than the phantoms that appeared during the day. They realized they couldn't stay hidden and were still pretty far from the exit, so Istolfa pointed to a church and they went to hide in there. They didn't find any phantoms in there, so they decided to spend the night there and look for the keys in the morning. However, a voice called out to them, telling them to keep their mouths shut because they were in a church, and they realized that this person wasn't a phantom but rather a human. Before their very eyes, the adventurer sliced the phantom into two and asked them to introduce themselves. Istolfa thanked him for saving them, but the guy insisted that they introduce themselves first. So Istolfa introduced himself and his team members, although they were pissed that he gave out their information to a sketchy dude. The guy said he was just messing around and introduced himself as Notes. They asked him what he was doing in the church, and he said he was there to pray and made some rude remark about Kyle and Duma looking more like cosplaying Nepo babies than adventurers. He claimed that they only made it that far because of Istolfa and they were reliant upon him for everything. But Istolfa refused to let his agenda fly, saying they all complemented each other and he wouldn't have gotten so far without their help. The guy said he had misunderstood them, but Kyle was already done with him and wanted to leave the church already. Notes told them to stay back because it was obvious. They had a hard time dealing with that floor, and he was willing to lend them a hand because he had a thing for Istolfa the moment he saw him. Kyle and Duma were quite annoyed because they weren't about to see their guy turn into Notes' nutty doll, but he made it clear that he wanted to be Istolfa's friend, and he needed a search team to help him find some things he had been unable to find on his own. The boys deliberated for a bit and agreed to work with him, although they wondered how useful he would be. But they turned to find that he was no longer beside them and had gone up to fight a phantom priest. They called out to him to watch out, but watched him instantly chop off the priest's head and tell them they hadn't seen anything yet because all his swords could end an enemy in one hit, and he had only used the death blade. Istolfa was curious about it, but Notes told him he was pretty confident that he would be using it someday because it didn't require any magic. And just like Istolfa, Notes couldn't use magic and could only use a sword. He acknowledged that not being able to use magic was a weakness, but it was because of that weakness that he knew Istolfa could do it, because it was an advantage that made up for his weak spot. Kyle and Duma were jealous because Notes and Istolfa had become besties overnight, so Kyle immediately said they should get back to business and plan their next move. There were incoming phantom robbers, about 6 in number, so the boys paired up and dealt with them. However, Duma encountered a problem when his attack was stopped by a robber and got stuck, but Kyle came to his aid by activating his fireball, and in the end, they got rid of all the phantoms. Afterwards, Duma pondered upon Notes' words when he said that he only made it so far because of Istolfa. So Duma realized that he probably was useless to Kyle and Istolfa with his dumb white magic, and that if he kept on that path, he would only hold the party back. He noticed how even at their current state, Istolfa was dedicated to becoming stronger, so he worried that he would be left behind and become more of a liability than an asset to his team. But just then, Notes interrupted his thoughts, saying he saw him fight and observed that he was pretty good at it, but there was a better job that would fit him other than just being a priest. Now that the boys had realized the church wasn't safe anymore, they decided to go elsewhere. Even though Notes insisted that he could protect them from anything that would come that way, but Duma suddenly asked them to use an orb of return and head back up to the surface because he wanted to try something out. Is Duma about to ask for a job change? And will the guys successfully find all the keys required to advance to the 7th floor? If you'd like to find out in part 2, type Steamy Stella in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, give a thumbs up and subscribe for similar content. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.